So instead of measuring the success of a prosecution solely based on something like conviction or the length of a sentence, but measuring it on the survivor's experience with that system, by measuring it upon the success of the relationships that we were building collaboratively across sectors. Not only was it a highly successful model, it actually became the model that had the highest conviction rate in Canada from 2020 to 2024.
You're listening to the One Door podcast. One Door, a first-of-its-kind collaborative hub. One Door that will ensure women and families can access coordinated wraparound support in a safe, dignified, and supportive place. Hello. Today on the One Door podcast, we're sitting down with Josie McKinney. Josie's a lawyer, consultant, and former Crown prosecutor whose work has shaped conversations around human trafficking, gender-based violence, and justice reform in Nova Scotia. Welcome, Josie.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you for being here. So I'm just going to jump right into some of your past work. You were Nova Scotia's first dedicated human trafficking prosecutor. How did that role come about?
So in 2019 and 2020, Statistics Canada released the latest data around rates of human trafficking nationally and provincially. And at that time, Nova Scotia, the stats for Nova Scotia is we had the highest rate provincially for human trafficking. And I believe at that time it was also higher than the national average. And so in response to that, the province made some announcements to allocate funding and resources to address the issues. So that included everything from a new dedicated provincial integrated human trafficking policing unit that combined RCMP and Halifax Regional Police, specialized investigators, specialized victim services positions, and there was resources into community like the YWCA, the Jane Paul Indigenous Resource Center, and then they created a dedicated human trafficking prosecution position. So it started off as a single position, and then I want to say a year or two later, they increased funding to the Prosecution Service to hire a second dedicated human trafficking position and a dedicated paralegal and legal assistant position to create a human trafficking prosecution team. So I was the appointed into the initial role in 2020.
Okay, wow. And during that time, you helped shape the province's first human trafficking model. What made that model different?
So there was a number of different things. And I would say at the outset, how I developed that model initially when I was on my own as the sole role in the prosecution service was in collaboration with community. So it's really important to say which is what made it different from the beginning. Typically, the prosecution service as an independent agency tends to make sort of organizational decisions on its own. And in my role, I was able to collaborate with community, other justice partners to shape what it looked like. So there's a few key components that I think really made the model different for the time that the model existed. And so that was, first of all, in collaboration with police, approaching the investigation of human trafficking the way that we investigate homicides, which is sort of your best foot forward, the maximum resources that you can put toward in policing and prosecution is often allocated toward homicides because they're considered our most serious crimes. And so what that means is you're gathering every possible evidentiary avenue you can find, video surveillance, bank records, lots of witnesses, cell phone records, cell tower records. So it's a sort of an all hands on deck, best foot forward approach. Oh, sorry.
I just want to dig into that investigation model a bit. So shaping them more like a homicide investigation as opposed to, say, a missing persons case. It's more of a question of resources and casting a wider net for evidence gathering.
Yeah. So and missing persons is a different beast altogether because people go missing for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with criminal matters. So I think a better comparison might be if you were investigating, a robbery. It's not that police are not going to investigate thoroughly, but the when you're investigating a homicide, the big thing that makes them different is that your victim isn't alive to tell their story. And so you have to piece together what their story was through everything else you can possibly find. And because the crime is so serious, we prioritize resources toward that. So the approach that was taken, and this wasn't my idea, this is work that was done in other provinces and that was adapted by our provincial integrated human trafficking unit, was what would it look like to prosecute human trafficking if the victim wasn't alive?
Okay.
So because in reality, by the time a human trafficking case goes to trial, that could be years after a charge is laid. They may not be with us, or they may be missing, or they may be so overwhelmed by the trauma of that event that they can't participate anymore. And so what would it look like to build a case that isn't so heavily reliant upon them if they weren't present to tell their story? And so that meant reallocating dedicated resources to be able to turn over every stone, essentially. Another key component was changing the way that we supported victims in that process. So what's really important is that police and prosecutors are not social workers. We're not healthcare providers. We're not psychologists. So we can't be doing that kind of work, which means to ensure that we're doing our part to support a victim, we have to build relationships with the people who do, understand how they do their work.
So that's bringing in those community partners that you were alluding to.
Exactly. So one of the things that I did as part of this model was create a case conferencing protocol. So at the time that I had that first meeting with a survivor after a charge is laid, in that first encounter, I'm not just asking them, what's going on? What do you want to see with this case? I'm saying, what's going on with you as a person? What are the needs right now that are not being met? And then with their consent, I reach out to relationships, resources that I have, contacts I have, and I convened a meeting with those individuals, again, with the consent of the survivor, and turned over that sort of wraparound care to those individuals, and then stepped out of that picture because, again, that's not my role. And so a lot of people might say, well, is that even really outside the role of a prosecutor? And I would say, no, it isn't. It's the bare minimum of what we can be doing, is understanding that our time in that person's life and our role in that person's life is pretty small in comparison to the broader needs. And so,
but impactful. So you want to make sure it's
very impactful.
Positive experience, or just not re-traumatizing.
That's right. And when that person is connecting with you, anytime an individual is connecting with any type of system, it's important for that system to not operate in a vacuum, to be able to have those relationships so that we can work with people and serve people in their whole self. And a part of that also meant that in taking this sort of survivor-centered approach was also allowing them to have autonomy in whether or not they were going to participate. So we would build these incredibly strong cases that now no longer depended solely on their word.
Okay. So if they decided they didn't want to participate in the trial could still go forward.
It could in some cases, not always. But even if it didn't, their autonomy became more important than the case itself. So there were times, it was by building cases that were strong enough to survive without them, it gave them confidence to continue to participate. They felt seen, they felt heard, they felt supported. But on top of, and because of these wraparound supports, again, they were better positioned to participate. But for the few that, for whatever reason, did not, came to a point where they no longer wanted to participate, we sat and talked to them through that, see if there was, something we could do to help them stay in the process. But if ultimately they concluded that they didn't, we supported that decision. And that is a return to power to someone who had previously had their power taken away from them. And if, as a result of that, they went on and made even were able to make find a life that was even a little bit better than the life that they had, that's still a success. So instead of measuring the success of a prosecution solely based on something like conviction or the length of a sentence, but measuring it on the survivor's experience with that system by measuring it upon the success of the relationships that we were building collaboratively across sectors. Not only was it a highly successful model, it actually became the model that had the highest conviction rate in Canada from 2020 to 2024.
Wow.
So even though the goal wasn't and shouldn't be about seeking convictions, the end result was that it was successful. That's no longer the model that's in place. But for that period of time that myself and the 3 other individuals that were on that team, who started on that team together, worked on that model, it was very successful. And the feedback that we received from survivors and community partners was that they were feeling the difference in the approach.
That's an insight I don't think I've heard articulated before, is that the outcome not being the conviction, but the experience of the survivor led to better outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind with the criminal legal system just in general. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Crime is almost always a reflection of the health of a community, our societal value systems, how we're showing up for people or not showing up for people. And the criminal legal system, for the time that it's in someone's life, whether they are there as a victim or as a person charged with a crime, it's such a short period of time and has a limited ability to shift the course of lives for those individuals, but it nonetheless has an ability to have impact, as you were saying. But that impact becomes, the potential for positive impact becomes heightened when we work collaboratively, when we start to see that person as more than just their criminal record or more than their experience as a victim of crime. When we start seeing them as a part of a community and we see ourselves as a part of that same community.
Okay, thank you. I just want to zoom out for a second and go back to what you said about the Stats Can report in 2019, 2020, driving some of this need in the province. So Nova Scotia has consistently reported some of the highest rates of human trafficking in Canada. What factors are driving that?
Yeah, so I think that's a really complicated question to answer. And I think there's not a single answer to that. So
and that's police reported human trafficking.
That's right. And so we know, with all sorts of crimes of gender-based violence and that these are underreported crimes. But there are a number of factors that, in my observation, contribute to Nova Scotia's rate. A huge factor is we are a very rural province outside of Metro Halifax. So not even HRM, because HRM is pretty rural outside of Metro.
Right.
Rural, I think it was something like 65% of the files that I handled during my time in that role were outside of Metro Halifax. They were happening, and they weren't individuals being taken from a rural environment by non-rural people and trafficked in cities or outside the province. They were victims who were being trafficked in their home rural community by people who lived in that rural community, particularly in areas like Pictou County, Yarmouth County, and the Kentville area. And so what I think is going on there, and again, this is my observation, is that rural environments are, I think, particularly susceptible to gender-based violence for lots of different reasons. I think in part because they are highly underserviced, not just on the resources you would think would be relevant, like counseling, addiction support, but on things like transportation, public transportation, access.
This is a theme that comes up in almost every episode of this podcast.
Right.
We're coming at it from different angles, and with Nova Scotia, transportation and lack of transit comes up every time. It's
huge. And I'll say on human trafficking, for instance, there were a lot of files that I saw where young teenagers were looking to get a drive. and a person, an adult, was willing to give them that drive in exchange for sexual services. At its highest level, some of the concerns in rural environments is, I think, in rural Canada, and probably in other countries, but in rural Canada, including Nova Scotia, you have these communities that are almost exclusively their economies are exclusively dependent upon male-dominated industries. So fishing, farming, logging, mining in some places. And what that does is it sets up this dynamic where women have less employment opportunities and are therefore highly dependent upon men to provide for their basic necessities, housing, food, and because there's less access to childcare, affordable childcare, it makes it even more difficult for women to find employment, less access to transportation. You have one-car households, very difficult to find affordable housing. So it sets up this dynamic where dependence on men isn't just an individual preference or a social norm. It is an act of survival, which can make it an act of survival even in the face of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And we know that many victims of human trafficking were first victims of intimate partner violence or child sexual exploitation. So this dependency can happen. I think it doesn't mean that doesn't exist in urban environments. It just is very heightened in a rural environment. And then when you don't have access to those types of resources that might open doors for you to make different choices that might make your survival less dependent upon a male provider, it can make it easier to make different choices for yourself to exit unhelpful situations. So when you think about human trafficking is almost always begins in the intimate partner context. It almost always begins with a trafficker luring a female young female victim with the promise of opportunities, care, love, affection. And if you're living in an environment where that is not plentiful, where there are not a lot of other ways for you to provide for those needs yourself, as is the case in rural environments, that makes it much easier to tempt you into those things. And then that's not even including when you start layering in things like racism, homophobia and transphobia, where we see that Indigenous and Black and trans women are overrepresented as victims of human trafficking because they have even less access to meaningful choice in their life, less access to love and affection and appreciation in community, in their outside of their communities. So that's very prevalent in rural environments. So that's part of the Nova Scotia story. The other thing to keep in mind is a lot of those statistics are a combination of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, which predominantly targets the newcomer community, temporary foreign workers.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that distinction because I think we often lump in human trafficking as sex trafficking, but there is a distinction there with labor trafficking as well. Yeah.
So human trafficking is very broad. So at its broadest, what human trafficking is, any time where someone is having to provide a labor or service, any labor or service, in circumstances where they don't really objectively have a real choice to stop providing the labor or service. So that labor and service can be pretty much anything. But when that service is sexual, that it involves sexual touching in exchange for some type of payment, it could be payment in money, it could be drugs, it could be a drive, it could be housing, whatever it is. When it's sexual, it makes it sex trafficking. And when it is anything else, it could be labor trafficking. And labor trafficking typically is going to involve, when most people are talking in the industry about labor trafficking, they're typically thinking about things like farm labor, domestic labor, temporary work labor services or low-paying service industry work. And most traffickers in the labor trafficking world target temporary foreign workers with the promise of like, come to Canada and we'll give you a job, housing, food. You won't have to, you just come and work and we'll provide for everything else. And then once they get here, they're given far less than what would be considered a living or even a minimum wage, even factoring in the housing and the food.
And then you also helped develop, first in Canada, prosecution policies focused on the fair treatment of Indigenous and African Nova Scotian people. What changes were those policies designed to make?
I mean, in the short answer to that is the goal was to contribute to the decarceration of Indigenous and Black people who are currently over-incarcerated and have been over-incarcerated for some time, Indigenous people for even longer. And those rates of over-incarceration are only increasing with time. So, you know, the over-incarceration of Black and Indigenous people is a broad issue with a lot of things that contribute to that, and broad, massive systemic discrimination. And I would say in Nova Scotia, I do want to highlight in particular, we see the over-incarceration of African Nova Scotian people as within the broader Black community because they have been here for 400 years. And so there's lots of factors that go into that. And the criminal justice system alone cannot address that. But there is a critical role to play, particularly the role of prosecutors. Prosecutors make a lot of decisions in the life of a case that can impact whether or not a person is going to be incarcerated and for how long. And so what those policies were designed to do, and at the time they were first in Canada policies, not because there were actually sort of other policies around Indigenous, handling of cases involving Indigenous people in other provinces, but they remained at a very conceptual level. What myself and my colleagues with the Equity and Diversity Committee who wrote those policies, what we were trying to do was create much more practical directive guidance to Crown attorneys. So rather than it remaining at this conceptual level, it was sort of at each stage of a case, this is how you can make a different, better decision that will contribute to decarceration.
Okay. Could you give us an example?
Yeah. So, for instance, when the very first thing that a Crown attorney does when they get a case is they have to consider realistic prospect of conviction. So there's a certain amount of evidence that has to exist that we need to have as a prosecutor to continue with a case. No matter how serious the case is, that always applies. So one of the things that in a case that could be quite relevant in whether or not you have a successive conviction is whether there was racial profiling by police involved. So we could sit and do training or have a policy that says, don't be biased, and here's the history of racism in Canada. But that really doesn't translate into what does it actually look like to assess racial profiling in a case. Not just when the accused person says there might be racial profiling. What does it look like to look at it on your own as a Crown attorney, not waiting for the defense lawyer to raise it, but we ourselves are doing that? And how does that connect into the accused charter rights? And how does their charter rights connect into the strength of the case? So it would be that kind of guidance. Then in deciding at sentencing, what are the factors that you would consider in how racism impacts this has shaped their life and their decisions? What are the services that might be uniquely available to them as an Indigenous or a Black person now? What services didn't exist to them that might have shaped their experience with the criminal justice system to date? It's all. So I mean, there's a ton of other examples, but those are just a few. And so those policies would say, here are the things that you need to be looking for and thinking about at each stage of the case. And then in addition to that, those policies, we also created a structure to further support Crown attorneys in implementing the policy. It was called the equity or race-based case consultation process, where Crown attorneys could reach into our equity committee if they had a case that involved a race-based legal issue to get support on how to handle it. Because the thing to keep in mind is we've only really been trying to tackle racism like in my lifetime.
Right.
And we're taking baby steps is what I would say. We've lived with no efforts to address racism for longer than we've lived with efforts to address racism. So it's not instinctual.
It takes time.
It takes time. These are muscles we have never exercised.
Right.
And so you're not going to be good at it.
Are these frameworks, to your knowledge, still in place?
So all of the policies still exist and are available on the Public Prosecution website. To the extent that they are being implemented, I can't speak to because I'm not there. And I took a secondment into a different role for a couple of years. And so I can't speak to how robust that work is right now. I would hope that they would continue because, again, they were very well received, not only by individuals involved in files, but by Crown attorneys themselves who, in my experience, the majority of which really did want to do a better job. They just didn't know how. And so these were tools at their disposal to help them to be able to do it. So I hope that that's still implemented, but I don't know if it is.
Okay. And then I just want to jump back as well. Did you spoke about the human trafficking prosecution model. Is that still in place?
No. So I know that's not in place. So I took a secondment into the role of acting executive director of the Status of Women office from 2023 to 2025, and then went back to the Public Prosecution Service in June of 2025 until January. And in that short period of time that I was back, much of the infrastructure that had been created in that model was gone. So the case consultation process was gone.
With those community
partners. We also had an advisory committee with the community partners to help us sort of discover the broader issues. That was no longer operational.
How did you feel about those changes when you saw them?
It was certainly disappointing. I can't speak to the reasoning behind it, and I certainly can't presume that those choices were not made with perhaps good intention and good reason. I just know that because the model was so effective and really well thought out, and built in partnership with survivors and community, it was disappointing to see it not there anymore, for sure.
Yeah. And that's a good segue into your time as acting executive director of the Nova Scotia Status of Women office. You advised on gender-based violence during that time. Looking back, where was the province at that point, and how has that conversation evolved since then?
Yeah, so at the time I started there, it was a few months after the release of the final report of the Mass Casualty Commission. And so it was an interesting time to join that office. And for folks who don't know, the role of that office, it remains the only department or office. It's not considered a department, but the only sort of office in government that is solely dedicated to addressing gender inequity. That's its broader role, and a part of gender inequity is gender-based violence. I can't say enough positive things about the folks that worked in that office. When I arrived in that office, I was greeted by a team of exclusively women who had lived the work, who were these were works of passion. This was works of love, highly expert, motivated. And then it also introduced me to this whole community environment in the women serving sector of transition houses and women's centers and folks working with men on gender-based violence, and it was an incredible opportunity.
Can I ask, when was that office established?
Oh gosh, I wouldn't know. Years,
dating back?
For over 10 years for sure, maybe even 20 years. So it's been around for a really, really long time, and there was really great work happening in community at that time. But the timing of coming in shortly after Mass Casualty Commission sort of threw this issue of gender-based violence into the spotlight in a way that I don't recall seeing in my time in Nova Scotia. And this Mass Casualty Commission, of course, is coming years after the the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and to us LGBTQIA people. And then a few months after Mass Casualty Commission, we had the final report of the Desmond fatality inquiry. So it was a very interesting time to be in there. One of the things that I feel like changed or that I observed changing, both within the office, because it was part of my role in being there, was to bring a more intersectional approach to understanding gender-based violence rather than a strictly sort of white feminist lens, but a much more intersectional, thinking about intersecting identities. But that conversation was also happening in community, and I think Mass Casualty Commission did a great job at highlighting how women are not a monolith. We are impacted by other identities that we share, other intersecting forms of discrimination, including, the experiences of trans women and non-binary folks. So that conversation was happening in a way that I hadn't seen in a long time. I was seeing a lot of increased collaboration within the nonprofit community and a lot of collaboration between government departments and community as well. So that was really positive to see. What I will say that was challenging to watch and remains a challenge is that there was a lot of heightened interest and dialogue around Mass Casualty Commission, but there wasn't the same level of dialogue and again, in my observation, urgency in responding to MMIWG and the Desmond fatality inquiry.
What was the timeline where that really came to prominence, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and the Desmond inquiry? So
missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was 2019, if I recall correctly. And then the Desmond fatality inquiry was, I think, early 2025. I want to say February 2025. And then Mass Casualty Commission, I think, was March. It might have been I might be wrong, 2023, 2024, in that area.
We won't hold you to it.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that sort of general timeline. So MMIWG had been around for significantly longer, and not just, and very little progress has been made on that, both provincially and nationally. And the same can be said about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the wrongful conviction into Donald Marshall Jr., and other inquiries that focus in on the experiences of Indigenous people. And I would say, in hearing feedback from the Black community in Nova Scotia, particularly the African Nova Scotian community, and again, in my own observation, I would say that, again, there isn't the same sense of attention and urgency collectively that we see on the experiences of that informed the outcome of the Desmond fatality inquiry. And so despite there being some progress in taking a more intersectional approach to gender-based violence, what I'm left feeling today is that Indigenous and Black women will still have to advocate harder and for longer to put their experiences
to capture
their experience. Even though there has been some movement, it's still nowhere near where it needs to be.
Can you speak a little bit towards your work with those groups at that time, those advocacy groups, and what they're trying to achieve or what their stories are that are being overlooked?
Yeah. So during my time at Status of Women, one of the pieces of work that our office decided to do, or I should say the office, it's no longer my office or our office, but the office worked on—
You left a mark, though, so I'm sure there's a connection still there.
Thank you. So one of the pieces of work that we did was to revamp our entire sort of strategic planning and organizational structure to better respond to all of those inquiries, plus Truth and Reconciliation Commission, plus the restorative inquiry into the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, so that we would be able to measure our contribution to addressing those recommendations, including the grant management process. So Status of Women administers discretionary funds into community. And so we revamped our grant management process to better align with those recommendations. And one of the necessary outcomes of that was building new relationships with communities that have been previously not being served as effectively as it could be, not just by that office, but by government broadly. So it involved building new relationships with organizations in the Black community, in the Indigenous community, in the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. It was such a really interesting experience. I think, and I can't speak for everyone at the office, but I feel like I know that the folks in that office really took a lot of value in that. And they themselves started to, in going through that exercise, folks themselves at the office really took that up and started coming up with new ways to work with people. So, for one of the really great examples, we every year, Department of Justice and Status of Women provide training on intimate partner violence. And for the couple of years, we wanted to zero in on the experiences of particular communities with gender-based violence and intimate partner violence specifically. So one year we partnered with the Association of Black Social Workers, where we essentially gave them our budget and allowed them to curate the learning experience for the folks, the audience, but we took all the administrative work. So the part about booking the space, registration, catering, all of the things that are not fun about organizing a conference.
And did anything come up recommendation-wise that surprised you from that group?
I wouldn't say necessarily that surprised me in terms of, because I'm a person who eagerly reads what communities have to say. But what I would say was, I shouldn't say surprising, but what was something that was confirm or affirming was how well received that training was by our partners across government, and how much I think more effective that training was, rather than us trying to pick speakers from community to say, tell us about the intersection of race and gender-based violence, but actually instead saying, you tell us what we need to know about that. You pick the speakers that you think are going to be most impactful. And the result of that was a really, really well-received training. And we did the same thing the next year with the Youth Project to focus in on the experiences of the trans community with intimate partner violence and gender-based violence. And so, again, these are innovative ways of working with community that were what those national and provincial inquiries asked us to do, and the results were effective.
Okay. That's a great success story, and sounds like a really good, well-rounded approach to getting new perspectives seen and heard. Yeah,
I think it was. I certainly learned. I mean, you're never done learning, so I'm always learning new things. But it was just great to build those new relationships, because again, I think people are in community are better experts. They're the experts in their own experience.
Okay, so Josie, so now you're taking this expertise and you've gone into consulting. Can you tell us what led you there?
Yeah, so I feel like in a way it's been something I've been building to my whole career, even though I've almost 20 years in criminal litigation, and it's been an honor to do that work, particularly the work around human trafficking. Some of the most meaningful work, same with working at Status of Women. But throughout my entire career, off the side of my desk on a volunteer basis, I've been doing this sort of systems change work, which is really my greatest passion. And it just got to, there was lots of reasons that informed the decision, but I just got to a place where, after building structures and systems within colonial organizations and for other people on their terms, I just wanted the opportunity to build, first of all, something for myself, and then to be able to build something that would allow me to help others build things on my terms, and particularly being able to center my experiences as an Indigenous woman and my values, Indigenous values in that work. So I made that decision. I'd been thinking about it for quite some time. And then ultimately launched a excitedly, but also fearfully out of my comfortable role in government and decided to leap into practice. So I opened Nestuit Consulting and Law, two separate practices in January of this year. And Nestuit is a Mi'kmaq word meaning become wiser. And I feel like that's my lifelong goal and journey. And that's what I like to be a part of other people's journey as we become enhance our collective wisdom. So it was really about that, being able to do something for myself that's grounded in my own value system.
Okay. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm curious, can I ask, in your practice, what does it look to have a decolonialized practice? Are there any factors you can point to?
Yeah. So, there's lots of factors. This is just a single person practice right now. So it really just is, being able to shape it around myself. But in terms of how that shows up in the way that I support other organizations, there's a lot of different factors, but a huge one is the concept of relational accountability. So in a colonial world, we really primarily define accountability either in terms of punishment or carrots and sticks, or in things like deliverables and outputs and outcomes. And again, those can be a part of accountability, but in Indigenous value systems, we think about accountability as a conversation about relationships. So how do relationships shape and influence behavior, including negative behavior that might be showing up in an organization, by an individual, or in a system? How are those relationships in turn shaped by those behaviors? And in focusing in on repairing relationships, how might that drive improved behavior or improved functioning in the future? And that really, we see some of those examples in things like, even in the criminal legal system, we see things like restorative justice, which tries to take a more relational approach. But that can be done in any context, including in an organization in the nonprofit sector, private sector, public sector. Those things can still be implemented in ways that can just change how we decide to improve functioning.
It sounds like redefining what a positive outcome is, which kind of going back to the human trafficking prosecution model.
Exactly. It is going right back to that. And, in measuring success, not just in those sorts of, metrics and outcomes and deliverables and those sort of things, but measuring it and in terms of the health of the relationships in an organization, the health of an organization's relationships with community, in terms of the relationships between leaders and those who report into leaders. So that's just one example of grounding something in Indigenous values systems or decolonizing. But there are lots of other examples.
Okay. And in general, what kind of challenges are organizations bringing to you today?
Yeah, so it's a lot of the similar things that I worked on while in government. So folks coming in with looking to improve how they respond to sexual harassment or discrimination in the workplace, looking to
which all funnels back to gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence and other sort of broad systemic issues. How to have healthier, more impactful, productive conversations around tensions like hate speech and freedom of expression, how to support workers who are experiencing intimate partner violence or who are experiencing racism and discrimination outside the workplace. What does that look like for an employer to support someone in the workplace? And what's interesting about that is I think there's this perception that people are generally resistant to those conversations. And I think there's good reason to think that. I think we are seeing a regression generally around those topics, particularly in other locations. But what I have always felt, and it is affirming to see that through the work now, is that there is always going to be a small portion of people who are actively resistant to those kinds of conversations, to conversations about equity and fairness. But more than not, there are people who just want to go to work and do a good job. And if we start redefining what a good job looks like so that it actually includes the values of communities that have been made vulnerable in society, we start shaping what it means to do a good job and supporting people to do the good job that they want to do, people are largely receptive to it. And so that's the work that I have always been very, proud to say, very successful at doing, is finding a way to translate these high concept, important issues into something that's realistic, practical, and job specific, organization specific, so that people can feel confident that they are doing a good job or a better job than what they were doing on these issues.
And one of the things we touched on, the mass casualty report, a big part of that was identifying workplace training and structural change as a potential leader for helping to combat gender-based violence. Can you speak to that opportunity and what you're seeing in your role?
Yeah, so I've been saying this in my entire career, and now I get to actually, focus on doing this work for this type of job training. And what mass casualty was saying is we need to move beyond, like I was saying earlier, this sort of high concept. So a way I describe it is the difference between soft skill training and hard skill training. So soft skills are those skills that are likely helpful to you in whatever job. And hard skills are very technical and specific to the role. So an example I would give in my role as a prosecutor, a soft skill might be learning to relate to people who come from different life experiences than my own. That would be useful in any job. If your job interacts with human beings in any way, that would be useful for you. Something very specific, going back to the example I said earlier, that is very highly technical, is understanding what racial profiling is and how that interacts with a person's charter rights, and then further how that impacts on the strength of a prosecution. So it's really critically important that organizations don't just try to do a one-size-fits-all with their policies and their internal training, but they instead bring people in to help them create super specific hard skill training. And that's how people can find it more palatable, more meaningful, and see success. Because that's the thing with any training. If you're not feeling success, you're really going to give up on it. And I think a lot of times people with well-intentioned deliver sort of cultural competency training or equity-based training that's so high level that it becomes very hard for people to implement it in a way that feels empowering, that they themselves can start seeing the success in it. So that's critical.
Is there an example you could point to of just one piece of training that's bringing it down to the reality of that person's job and relating or being received better than something a little more high level?
Yeah. So I recently did some training in the academic environment on sort of concepts around that tension between hate speech, freedom of expression, and academic freedom. And so
this would be for like a university classroom?
Yes, exactly. Post-secondary institution, but for their leadership team. So that's a few contexts. So that's both academic environment, leadership team. The role of a leader is very different than a person who is teaching or who is a social worker or who is a lawyer. And even leaders in those like lawyer environments, teaching environments have very different specific roles. And so in delivering that training, I taught the concepts, introduced the concepts in a way that, using examples and breaking down sort of legal terminology into things that were accessible, and then provided a specific tool crafted and honed for leaders in the academic environment that would help guide them through a specific case, and then gave them a hypothetical to practice using the tool with and practice what they had just learned. So this is the type of training I have been delivering throughout my career, is this combination of here's the concept, here's the tool, here's how you're going to practice it. And so the feedback that I received at that time was that it was very effective and very, very meaningful. They felt like they were walking away with something that they could do differently immediately.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly effective because I know, in the entire academic landscape, there's a lot of fear over that topic of hate speech and freedom of expression in the classroom. And I can imagine both academics and leaders just not wanting to touch it at all or wanting to avoid the topic. So it sounds like getting really specific with them is super effective.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's helping people get over the fear because going back to that analogy, which I use a lot around muscles that you've never exercised. Mm-hmm. So just like when you're doing, I'm by no means a personal trainer or an athlete, but the general concept of when you're working new muscles that you've never worked before, you're sometimes going to pull a muscle. Mm-hmm. But if you stop doing that training simply because you've pulled the muscle, you're never going to improve that muscle. Mm-hmm. You have to move through the pain. And part of doing this, tackling these difficult topics means working through the pain and the discomfort of making a mistake, of having a failure, learning from that failure, pivoting and trying again. And that's particularly important to leaders because it is a good leader should never consider it an option to tap out of an uncomfortable conversation out of fear of failure. Mm-hmm. Leaders are critically important in shaping the culture of workplaces, and they can give workers the confidence for themselves to try something new, to push themselves out of their comfort zone.
Wow. Thank you. Before we wrap up, I just want to ask a final question that kind of brings it all together with your varied career. But as a prosecutor, policy advisor, and now consultant, what have you learned about what it actually takes to create meaningful systems change?
I think it takes a lot of things. I always sort of think of what did it take to create the problem? Mm-hmm. So when I think about every great injustice that our society has seen, I often think of it taking, having 4 ingredients. It takes a leader to envision it, mm-hmm. lawyers to justify it, policymakers to structure it, and a critical mass to accept it as normal. We need those same ingredients to change it. We need leaders to envision proper change, lawyers and policymakers and other people to structure and justify the reason why this progress needs to change. And as important, if maybe even more important, is a critical mass of people to say, this is the type of change we want, that we're demanding. And I think Nova Scotia's has always been a leader, has always punched above its weight when it comes to the general public's demand for increased fairness and justice.
Wow, thank you. That's a really great insight and a great note to end on. Well, thank you so much, Josie. This has been really informative, very insightful, and we really appreciate you bringing your expertise to the podcast.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Together, we're building a healthier and safer future for generations to come. Your support will help create a safe, supportive, and empowering space where women, elderly, families, and youth can heal, learn, and thrive. To donate, visit onedoor.awrcsasa.ca. Every contribution, no matter the size, directly supports programs, services, and spaces that foster dignity, care, and community strength across rural Nova Scotia.